early season like this, when the fish are coming in to the shallow waters, the reason they're coming in is to feed. We've got perch that were just in here spawning, finishing up. They're going to stay in here for a while and feed after they're done spawning. Minnows come in to feed on the perch eggs. There's just tons of bait that comes into these areas early in the season because of everything is spawning. We're targeting walleyes, pike, and bass, specifically walleyes and pike though, in the reeds this time of year. They're going to come in, like I said earlier, they're going to put the feed bag on. First go-to setup I'm using is 1/8 ounce to 1/4 ounce jig with fluorocarbon leader, at least 40 pound, mainly because you get a big walleye on, gets on the edge, you don't want it cutting you off, especially for these big pike that we're catching. You can get a few different fish on one of these leaders. I start out at 2 foot, and then as the leader gets chewed up from fish, I can cut off, retie above the chewed up spot, and get quite a few days out of 1 leader. The 1/8 ounce jig works really good on days when there's not a lot of wind, because it's going to sink a lot slower than 1/4 ounce. Keep that lure in the strike zone a little bit longer. And when it's windy, you're going to want to go with a little bit heavier jig, mainly just so you can feel the bait hit the bottom. You can actually see it on your line as it hits you. The line will go slack. It's a lot easier to work on windy days. Today it's not real bad, so we're going to be fishing with mostly 1/4 ounce or 1/8 ounce jigs. And this is the one setup that I would first go with. This, if you're not really familiar with jigging and trying to keep your stuff out of the weeds, you might want to check out the next technique that we use. That's a weedless setup. These will go through the reeds without hooking them, and then when the fish hits us, you just slam them. So you've got a weedless hook rigged through with a flip tail creature with a small tungsten weight here. That's just going to ensure that the lure gets down to the bottom, up to a swivel, also with a fluorocarbon leader. Some of the lures that we really like to use for this type of fishing is these are actually flip tail creatures by flip tail lures. We got a couple of different colors. We got motor oil and then yellow creatures. Jigs that we're using mostly are these new Berkeley jigs, and then Gulp Alive for the plastics. This is the stuff that I really enjoy using. We've got a 4-inch minnow rainbow, really neat color. It's got a lot of purple and white and gray to it. And then also my absolute favorite when it comes to Gulp walleye fishing is the watermelon pearl crawler. These things will catch fish. If you're fishing rivers, lakes, doesn't matter, they catch fish. I'm going to rig this one up with the 4-inch minnow to start off with today. How we're fishing this rig is casting it out into the reed bed. And you're going to start off looking for the fish when you're scouting. Start on the outside edge of the reed bed, keep your boat out at least 10 yards from the reed line, because a lot of times those walleyes, they're not quite up into the reeds, they'll be right on that edge. You're going to cast that lure up into the shallows. When the jig hits the bottom, your line goes slack. Every time it goes slack, you just give it a reel, 1.5 turns. 1.5 turns. And that's all that's going to do is just work that jig up and down right through the reeds. And when you're hitting a reed, you'll feel it. It'll kind of come up over the top. A little bit of pressure, you're better off to just give it a good little tap. That's going to bounce it off of the reed, and then when it hits the bottom and that fish grabs that, it's going to actually jerk it. It'll go and pop that line back a couple of inches. You just put the hammer to them. If you can't find them on the outside edge, then just work into the reed bed a little bit farther as you go. A lot of these reed beds that we're fishing, they're 400, 500, 600 yards long and 50 to 80 yards wide. So there's a lot of reed bed to cover. We're going to start out on the outside edge today, work our way in and see if we can't find some walleyes and pike. It is the species we're after, just a little guy.
Yeah.
We bumped the boat out to the outside edge of the reeds. We're casting just on the outside edge and up in about 5 feet into the reeds. And that little guy was right on the outside edge, popped it, and let that one go. That was on the 4-inch Gulp Alive minnow. When fishing the jig instead of the weedless presentation, you're going to be hooking a lot of these reeds. This time of year, this is all old reeds. This is last year's reed bed that we're fishing. The new growth reeds haven't come up yet. So I'm going to cast right into them. And pretty much every single cast, you're going to hook at least 1 reed, especially in these thicker parts that we're in right now. got hooked up right now. I'm just gonna give it a good pop, break that loose. I just had 3 reeds in a row that I had to pop loose. And just by giving it a really good hook set, it forces that jig and it pops it right through the reed. One thing that definitely will help is if you can position the boat where you can cast directly into the reeds and work it out. If the wind allows for that, you end up snagging a lot less. When you get into these thicker reed beds, it really pays to go weedless. My dad's in the front, he's been fishing the weedless the whole time. Got a smallmouth and a northern already. I got a walleye fishing on a jig, and it's just a lot nicer not having to constantly set the hook to break it free of the reeds. I'm just working our way down the outside edge, fishing in 3 feet of water right now. The jig is landing in about the same 3 feet up inside the reeds. I'm working it back out to the boat.
Nice gator.